Welcome to the Serious Leisure Podcast. My name is Petya Petrova. I'm your host for today's podcast. I'm joined by our regular podcast contributors, Dr. Sam Elkington and Kat Branch. Sam is from Teesside University. He's our Serious Leisure expert. Welcome, Sam.
Thanks, Petya. Hello, everybody.
Kat leads the University of the West of England Centre for Music. Welcome, Kat.
Morning, everybody. Hello.
For our listeners, we often refer to the University of the West of England as UWE. So what is this podcast about? Well, in this podcast, we share stories about our leisure pursuits, about our passions, our hobbies, and our interests. We reflect on our attempts to successfully or not so successfully balance work and leisure time. And we draw on insights from the serious leisure perspective and the vast literature on it. You're listening to our season 3. You can find recordings of our 2 first seasons on soundcloud.com. We are very excited to welcome today our 2 guests. Martin Williams is lecturer in marketing at UWE. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
And we also have George Howard, who is an alumnus of UWE. He graduated in 2015 with a BA in business management with economics. Welcome, George.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Martin and George, we're so grateful that you're joining us today. And we're so grateful to Kat and Sam for their continued engagement with this podcast. And don't we have an episode for you today? Martin and George are here to talk to us about Dungeons and Dragons. Many of you may be familiar with D&D. For others, watching the TV series Stranger Things, maybe the closest thing you've come to Dungeons and Dragons, D&D. But some of you may be saying, say what now? What are we talking about here today? So let's start with what Dungeons and Dragons is. George, would you just explain to us here and to our audience, what is Dungeons and Dragons?
The core element of it is a improv story. You as a character can do anything you would like, with your actions and your results being decided by talking to the person who's running the game, known as the Dungeon Master or Game Master, depending on what they prefer to be called, and by rolling a dice, which is normally a 20-sided dice. From the number of the dice, so 20 being the best you can get, 1 being the lowest, you can tackle issues depending on how well you do as a character build. So for example, if you're trying to solve a riddle, a smarter character might roll a d20 and then add 4 onto whatever they roll, or someone who's maybe not as smart might minus, say, 2. And reduce the overall roll. From there, you work together as a team to complete a story, which has been very loosely created, and working together to support each other to get to the ending.
Thanks, George. That was a valiant attempt at this, and I think I just about get it. But I'll give Martin a try to explain what Dungeons and Dragons is. And hopefully with 2 explanations, we kind of build a fuller picture if we never encountered any kinds of kind of gaming of that nature. Martin, would you give us your take on Dungeons and Dragons, please?
Well, I think you have to imagine a group of people sitting around a table telling a story together. And one person's called the Dungeon Master or the Games Master. And as George says, all the rest of the people around the table are playing characters, participants in that story. And the Dungeon Master will sort of set out the story, tell you what you see, tell you what's happening, and you have to decide as a team how to react. So you can do all sorts of things. You can do anything you like. As George says, as long as you've got the ability to be able to do it, you can roll dice, the funny shaped dice that we often associate with these kinds of games, to see whether you manage to do it. And the better you are at doing a particular skill, the more chance that you succeed. So it's working together as a team to tell a story. That's how I tend to think of it.
It's set in a fantasy type setting, isn't it, Martin? So we're not talking about, a role playing an adventure to Tesco, right? So it's or imagining, we're in New York going on a shopping trip. It's very much set in this sort of fantasy world of elves and goblins. And
very much so, yes. And Dungeons and Dragons is a fantasy world, but you can have role-playing games in all sorts of different genres. So Traveller was another classic one, which is science fiction. Call of Cthulhu is kind of set in the world of an author called H.P. Lovecraft, where you're playing sort of Victorian or turn-of-the-century adventurers trying to sort of deal with cosmic horror. There are all sorts of different things, and it's just growing and growing. There's so many.
But D&D is the original, right, Martin?
D&D is the original, yes. Started in 1974, so it's coming up on its 50th anniversary before too long.
Right. So now we have the genre, the bigger picture, the masters, dungeon masters. We have interesting dices, and we have scores and choices that create some kind of narrative, but also there is a range of improvisation and storytelling. I'm kind of looking at everybody here, on our recording, and I'm getting some kind of notes, but this is my interpretation as somebody who's never done Dungeons and Dragons before. So hopefully we're all a little bit clearer. Let's delve into the stories of Martin and George in terms of their Dungeons and Dragons history. So Martin, can we start with you? How and where your Dungeons and Dragons journey started? And where do we currently find you? So tell us your history with this, please.
Well, I started playing a very long time ago. I started playing in 1983, I think, and I was introduced to it by friends. And I think, in the 1980s, it was, became quite popular. I think if you were a reasonably, imaginative, creative kid in the 80s, either you would find it or it would find you. That's what happened with me. I was introduced to it through friends and really loved it. So I started playing with a wider group at school and started my school's kind of role-playing club with a few others. And then really got into it in a big way at university. So as an undergraduate, I went along to my role-playing games club and met some people, and I'm still playing with them, whatever it is, 30 plus years later. So it's been off and on over the last 30 years, more on than off. But we try to get together probably about once a quarter for a weekend and start rolling the dice. Yeah.
Thanks, Martin. We would delve in a minute about how do you sustain an interest in a hobby and a group of friends for 30 years. George, can you tell us about your history? And I think they kind of overlap here with Martin. Where and how did you start your Dungeons and Dragons journey?
I started at quite a young age as well. When I was at school, me and a few friends, we decided to give it a go. One of my close friends, his dad, was quite a big fan of Dungeons and Dragons. So we thought, yeah, we'll give it a go. We'll see how it is. And we were absolutely horrendous. We did not know what we were doing. It was chaos from start to finish. We didn't really know the rules. We didn't really know what we were doing. So it didn't really pan out that well. But I had fun, and the others not so much. So as a result, it was tabled for quite a while for me. Then when I got to my final year of university, I had a few other friends who were telling me about their stories of doing Dungeons and Dragons, also known as D&D, and I wanted to get back into it. So I found a few people who wanted to play and just start playing. Then during COVID, we got back into it, and we've been playing nearly weekly since then.
Thanks, George. Okay, so we have a history starting in the 80s. Kind of childhood encounters, university clubs, COVID kind of pushing and sustaining this, but we also have Martin's long-term engagement with a group of people coming together and playing Dungeons and Dragons. And Martin, I'm just wondering, how do you sustain a hobby? And how do you sustain a group of people engaging in the same hobby for 30 years? How does that work?
Well, it's not easy. It's not easy to make time always. So we try and find a weekend, say about once a quarter, that we can get together. But I think, it's because it's fun. That's because it's hugely enjoyable. It's just, I think if you were to watch us playing a game of D&D, you would probably see us just laughing a lot. for quite a long time. These games can go on for several hours, but it's just huge fun. We're just laughing and sort of ribbing each other. And, if somebody does something silly, we'll have a bit of a laugh about it. Or if somebody tries to do a silly accent or something, we'll kind of rib them a little bit about that. So it's just a sort of a framework around which we have a conversation, tell a story, and laugh a lot. And I think because it's adventurous and challenging, and escapist and all of those kind of things, it's something we want to do. We want to meet. We'll travel halfway across the country to meet up for a weekend and do it together. But I think also, guys, particularly from my own experience, need a reason almost to sort of get together. I think D&D has been that for us. So it's helped sustain our friendship over all those years and keep us in contact with each other because we want to get together and do this as a group. So I think it's been really positive from that point of view. It's given us an excuse to get together. And I think it's really helped us as well, because I think, obviously things like male suicide is a problem in society. And I think anything that gets people together, to have fun together, to laugh together, drink some beer and have some snacks and all of those kind of things, it's just an incredibly positive thing. And I think, not long ago, there was, I think Prince Harry and Prince William were doing some work around using football to help with sort of male mental health. And I think if you're not into sport particularly, D&D kind of can serve a similar function. And so it's a really positive thing. It's been a completely positive thing in my life for a very long time.
Thanks, Martin. There's so much to unpack in what you just said, and I'm sure Kat and Sam would come in shortly. I'm interested in the logistics of this. So do you plan a Dungeons and Dragons weekend away? Do you do it in the evenings? Do you do it in person? Do you do it online? How and when do you meet? And how do you schedule it logistically? How do you make time for it? How do you organize it?
Well, when we were in university, we would play in the evenings and play quite a lot of it, and even longer as we went on into third year. Third year, we were playing an awful lot, which is probably the one year you really shouldn't be playing too much of it, focusing on your exams. But yeah, we used to play in the evenings at university. It becomes hard as you get older and you've got responsibilities. So we have to plan ahead. We have to sort of put those dates in our diaries so we can work around family commitments. And we just plan it. The Dungeon Master will organize the actual activity itself. We prefer to meet in person, but you can play it online. I think there are what they call virtual tabletops. So even if you are geographically separated, you can kind of log on. I haven't really tried them very much, but you can log on and play together over the internet, a bit like a Zoom call. But we tend to try and get together, just for maybe 3 or 4 weekends a year.
Martin and George, I have to admit that I've just started doing D&D with my family at home. So my boys are 8 and 10, and we thought we'd have a crack at it as a family. But I was listening to how you both got into D&D, and I'm quite jealous of the fact that, Martin, in your case, you kind of got sucked in via osmosis about how to do it, because I'm the kind of drama theatre person in our house, right? So Dungeon Master clearly falls to me. And I'm fiddling around, flapping through the book. I'm trying to look up monster details. I'm trying to tell people what dice they're meant to be doing, narrating the story. And I just feel like I'm dithering around and really envious of that experience of how you learned. And then, George, when you were describing, how you bumbled through that first time and how you had a great time, but the people with you were like, nah, because it was a bit untidy. I wonder, how did you then establish yourself into understanding what to do? So if you're learning with people who already do it, great, but what if you haven't got a clue but you still want a taste of these fantastic benefits that Martin's been talking about? George, do you want to jump in?
Well, to be fair, you never really stop bumbling around. You never really truly know everything which is going to happen. It's a case of still working together to flounder your way forwards and still come to a conclusion, really. So as there are the core rules to it, which, depending on who you're playing with, some people are very, very strict on the rules, and some people are very much the case of roll a dice and see what happens. It's a case of trying to find the right sort of play style, really. And then over time, you do start to get a bit faster, you do get a bit quicker. But a lot of the time, failing is good. Failing is fun. It's when all the bad things happen, sometimes that's the basis to a great story. Being a fantasy world, if you are trying to do a French accent and it's completely failed, it's a fantasy world. It doesn't matter. France doesn't exist. That could just be the way that they talk. And everyone has a laugh. Everyone has a bit of a giggle. And it creates the base to inside jokes sometimes. So unlike Martin, I play mainly online. Although I've got everyone based in the same city as me in Bristol, it's easier to do it through online services such as Roll20 or Foundry. But when we are running through and we're trying to find the name of the local pub, and the person running it has to try and make like a random pub name, and the first thing that comes up on the system is just new text, that's going to be the name of the pub, and we all leap on it and we're having fun and just rolling with it. These sort of things, it's just like a happy accident. It's just one of these sort of things which you just roll with it, really.
I'm really pleased that the floundering then, that's actually part of it. Because I mean, we're all having fun while we're trying to learn this together. But I'm just thinking of, Martin, your amazing experience. You've been playing since 1983. You've been playing with those friends for the last 20 years. I bet you get together and you're just in and you're doing a thing, and that's amazing. Where we get out, we're dusting off the bits of paper, everyone's writing things down. I'm flapping through a book, But actually, George, I'm really happy then that the dithering and mistake making is all part of it.
Yeah, we still do that even after all this time. So don't worry.
I wonder which question to ask first, whether it's the mistake making and how much that's actually fun, or whether it is about what is fixed and what is flexible. So you both mentioned that there is a level of improvisation, but there's also rules and pages to flick through that kind of guide the narrative or the story. So how is that balanced? How is the fixed and the improvised balanced?
There is quite often like a fixed structure. So you want to get from A to B, you want to slay the dragon and rescue the princess. So there's always that sort of crux to the story. The improv is more on how you get there. And the steps that you take, and that just like any book you read, any movie you watch, if you're always succeeding, can sometimes be less rewarding. You need to have the fails. You need to see, oh, you're so close, but then you stumbled at the last minute, just so you can do better next time. You can kind of pick yourself up, rise up, and do better. But sometimes it is these sort of mistakes that are made, which you then have to like try and bounce back off. So if you're talking to someone and you accidentally like cough in their face, and it's trying to recover yourself, and it can sometimes lead to some of the best stories because it just completely puts you in your feet and you just start panicking and have to pick yourself up. There is a element of, if the person running it really knows what they're doing, they can lead you down a certain route without you even realizing. But a lot of the time, it's up to you and how you want to tackle this situation, or how do you wish to proceed, just like in real life, really.
Although, George, there's much more of a sense of kind of freedom and fun, isn't there? Sort of.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
In real life, how you're making it up as you go along, and the secret to adulting is that no one knows what they're doing. But unfortunately, that fact is actually stressful and exhausting, and we all wish we could escape from it. Whereas on the other hand, the way you set out the D&D experience, that whole, we could do this or we could do that, it's kind of liberating. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, at the end, but also at the end of the day, because you are playing a game with your friends, if there is a horrendous mistake which is made, it doesn't have any real world impact. If you do want to talk to someone and you bite your tongue and you completely fail, in real life, that's quite embarrassing. Those are the memories that you keep with you for the rest of your life. In Dungeons and Dragons, it's fun. You realize what's going on. You realize it's probably not that big a deal overall, and you can move on. So once you start experiencing that, at least I found in D&D, it is something that you can bring forward to life in I'll say the real world, but it does give you that realization that sometimes things do happen, but you roll with what you've got and you can just keep pushing forward.
So it sounds like helping with a life philosophy, but maybe also like a testing ground, some of these amazing skills we're meant to have as adults. Is that right, Martin? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when we were chatting the other day, Kat, you said, that you could almost sort of split D&D into well-being and skills. And I think certainly on the sort of skills side of things, there's all sorts of different things that it helps with. Yes, there's kind of, as George says, that sort of safe space to sort of try things and if they work, then great. If they don't, then no big deal. But there's all sorts of other things going on. There's literacy, there's numeracy, there's teamwork, there's working with people who are very diverse and bring different things to the team. There's resilience, there's problem solving, there's, if you're a DM, there's running meetings, there's sort of business applications, there's all sorts of great skills, I think, that you can get out of D&D, social skills. So yeah, it can do an awful lot for people, I think.
Thanks, Martin. Just to clarify, being DM is Dungeons Master. Yes.
Yeah, sorry about that. Dungeon Master, yeah, DM in D&D. Sometimes you might hear it called GM, which is Games Master. Some games refer to it slightly differently, but yeah, same thing.
Thanks, Martin. And I'm aware Sam's been waiting patiently. And I think we'll say the usual things like, I've now written 5 pages of notes here, and where do I begin, people? So, Sam, take it away.
It is true, folks. I have written many, many pages of notes already. I've actually been quiet here because I've been reaching for the Serious Leisure book, an introduction, and because my brain was telling me Dungeons and Dragons is explicitly mentioned in said book, and I was frantically trying to find where in the book it was found, and I was right. Well, so I should be. I helped write the book, but it was page 79, just for people that are keeping up with the game. It's in the section around games-based hobbies in terms of how we might situate the core practice or the core activity, and particularly around the core activity of role-playing games, and Dungeons and Dragons is explicitly mentioned there. And what's really interesting is both Martin and George were talking about that there's two, I think, kind of core tensions here, which are really interesting in terms of the broader conversation we're having. The first one is, it is a game art based on decision making. It's based on decision making informed by accumulated knowledge of and experience with the game itself. So we have Martin on one side of the spectrum, started playing 2 years after I was born, just to make you feel really old there, Martin. And we've got Kat, who's very recently joined, but that accumulated knowledge and experience is part of that hook, isn't it? It's part of that draw. What it is as well, because it's a role-playing game, it's a game of chance. We don't really know what's coming. It's completely improvised. But inherent within that, and you hear it in what George and Martin are how they describe their experiences, it's very creative. There's there's no risk aversion here. It's just about being creative, wholly creative in what we're doing. That's core for me in terms of what I'm hearing, and for the experience born out of that creativity. We don't necessarily have that license, or what then links into the second point I've written down here is this sense of agency. Because it's a purely fantasy world, we're the authors of that world. And I think, there's an element of escapism there, isn't there, in terms of what we've just discussed, particularly in the last 2 years, in terms of COVID. Well, I want to escape the draw reality, the wholly negative reality of the moment, and escape into a world that I know I have control over. So that escapism, that authorship, and that kind of control, or that agency, I think, are key features in how you both describe it. Would you agree with that, Martin?
Absolutely. I think that's very insightful. I think, in the real world, if there's a problem, we tend to have to go through various kind of hoops to try and solve it. In this game, if there's a particular problem, you can, pick up a sword and, just go and deal with it. So that sense of agency, I think, is absolutely key to it. Escapism, you mentioned as well, definitely just being somebody else for a while and seeing the world through somebody else's eyes. That's definitely part of it. adventure. Certainly Gary Gygax, one of the co-creators of D&D, he always said that he thought that's what the big draw was, that, you know, we don't really get to be adventurous very much in society these days. We sort of sit doing things with spreadsheets. You know, we used to go out and bring down a mammoth or something so the tribe could feed, and we don't get to do that anymore. We go to the supermarket. So, you know, having an adventure, it's kind of playing into some quite sort of primal instincts potentially. So there's all sorts of things going on in there, creating a challenge. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's probably worth mentioning things like progression as well, because, you know, we hear the government talking a lot at the moment about, you know, leveling up. It's that phrase that gets used a lot. That comes from D&D. That's where that phrase starts. And then D&D influenced computer games. And, you know, obviously you hear it in that context as well. But this idea of progressing, of sort of moving forward, of getting better and getting more powerful as you get better. And the sense of camaraderie as well is something that, as I mentioned before, is a really important part of it. So yes, there's a lot of really complex things going on in there, agency being a really, really important one.
To add on to that as well, what you said about being like the author of your own story, I think is a great experience as well. So as there are what's called modules, which is like the stories published by Wizards of the Coast, the company which owned Dungeons and Dragons. And that goes to what we were saying before about you following that sort of set story. But as you're going from point A to point B to point C, it is like a Chinese whispers where you create your own ways to get there. So it is tackling the issues at hand. It gives you that sort of freedom. You make something yours. When you're making this story, it's not a story, it's your story, one that you've made with your friends, and you can come away from these sessions and be happy with yourself. Like, yeah, I did that. That happened because of me. And if you do something wrong, there can be consequences. But it's, again, going back to how you tackle those. And it is like giving that sort of freedom and that sort of free space to do as you wish.
I love the fact you've mentioned space there as well, because again, it's an element of, it's certainly a shared space, isn't it? I mean, you can hear it in how both George and Martin are talking here, and it's a shared space, and it transcends modalities, if you like. So you've got the face-to-face kind of, I guess, traditional way of playing the game, but then you've got the online version as well. But it's all creating that shared space in which to be creative and to have fun, as you've both said. Martin, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I've heard since I've been lecturing at UWE a lot is this concept of the co-creation of value. That value happens, you know, in the space between companies and customers, but also with my marketing hat on, but also just between people. So it just suddenly made me think of that, listening to you speaking there, Sam. You know, that there's co-creation of value being going on in a game of D&D. It's in that space between where we interact. Yeah, definitely.
You know, I feel like there's something, Martin, from what you described, and George actually, in the way that co-creating process creates this sense of connection. Then, doesn't it? It creates this bond. So, I mean, if you've been meeting with your uni mates for the last 20 years or whatever, that tells you the strength of connection that the activity is bringing to your social relationship. In fact, it's something we've definitely found as a family. You know, sometimes family time can feel like a bit of a chore if you take the children to, you know, Peppa Pig land, to quote somebody we heard recently. These kinds of activities, not necessarily that engaging for adults, but we've loved our D&D experiences, and we've had this huge sense of bond about the shared world that we co-created, and the way that everybody could express themselves individually within it. Most of my family have chosen cool names like Aldrich and Theorin, and then my youngest boy wanted to be a human called Jeff with a pet wolf. That's fine, so he could do that. And so he could participate in his way. And then as the dungeon master, who's in control of everything, this, I'm revealing things about myself now, this of course suited me down to the ground. Well, I suppose cycling back, I just wanted to observe that it seems to me to be that the co-creation is a social connecting activity, you know, that gives us this feeling of being with other people, being seen by them, you know, that shared laughter around the table. You know, is that really the heart of what brings you back to it, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's having fun, as Martin was saying earlier, it's having fun with your friends. Every time where we play, it's gives you an excuse to, after work, to have to finish work for the day, and like, yeah, you know what, embrace the imagination behind it, embrace the escapism, and it's fun. You're going around, you're having a bit of a laugh with your mates, and it does give you an opportunity to really embrace that imaginative side. There's not too many outlets in modern day, especially with everything going on at the moment, to really experience those ways to delve into your imagination, to really start thinking about, right, let's think of a character, let's think of a situation and play it out. Unless you're into sort of theatre or improv, you don't really get that opportunity.
Thanks, George. The definition of improv is often based around its collaborative storytelling. And it sounds like playing Dungeons and Dragons is an endeavor of collaborative storytelling. So I wonder, George, if you can kind of compare your experiences of engaging with Dungeons and Dragons and experiences you might have in the improv world, and how are they similar and how are they different?
So I've actually had quite a lot of experience in before with doing drama. From doing drama, I liked making these stories, like playing these characters, and that's one of the things which really got me into doing Dungeons and Dragons. My current group are friends I've made through working with the Kelvin players in Bristol. But then as I did D&D more and I got really into it, and it was playing around with this sort of improv, I delved further into the theatre, started taking improv classes. So they both bounced off each other really well. It is a lot of working together with your fellow players. So in improv, there's a lot of bouncing between people, saying yes and is always a key phrase of saying, if someone wants to do something and you don't really disagree, you don't really agree, you don't really disagree, you're like, you can kind of bounce off each other. In improv, that's critical. That's one of the core components of improv. And I would say that's also one of the key principles of playing Dungeons and Dragons. It is a case of working together to try to cooperate and bouncing up these ideas and these theories. And it's like, oh, what if I do this? Okay, you do that, but then this happens. And it can be good, it can be bad, and that's where the dice comes in, because sometimes you can think of the most fantastic idea, and then it's what happens next. Everything goes great, everything goes badly. And in improv, and especially in drama, it is a case of rolling, just going along with what's happening. And it's very easy to translate that across to D&D, but just with more maths. I have very quickly learned how to do very minor mental maths and how to use a calculator very quickly without even realizing.
Thanks, George. Got it. That it's improv plus maths equals Dungeons and Dragons. Martin, I think you want to come in here.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with George about the maths thing. I think, things like literacy and numeracy, it's definitely a sort of a force for good in those spaces. And I've done some teaching in secondary schools and encouraged gaming clubs there, because I think it can help with those two, really key skills. And certainly for me, numeracy, I wasn't probably the most numerate kid, but actually I definitely got better through playing D&D, to the point where I actually got pretty good at it, and it's an important skill for marketing. I probably wouldn't be doing my job today if I hadn't got better with numeracy, which I almost entirely put down to playing D&D when I was a kid.
I think also one of the, I didn't want to scare anyone off as well, but with the I think a lot of people look at D&D and see like the big complicated words as well. And when you're running it, if you mispronounce it, that's absolutely fine. If you want to say Mordenkainen and you say Mordy, yeah, that's just what they're called now. It's can be quite intimidating at first when you see all the big phrases, the big words, the big numbers. But if you just want to roll with it, who's to say that's not the way it is?
So actually, it's really inclusive, isn't it? I mean, some of the fantastic activities we've talked to our guests about on this podcast are things that really I could never dream of doing, honestly, without having more time in my life or really a completely different physical or mental self, being blunt. But, you know, what I love about what you've described there, George, is that anyone can participate in any way that they want to. And so unlike some of the other types of serious leisure we've sometimes talked about here, there isn't a prerequisite of skills, knowledge and training. So obviously a really experienced dungeon master can create a fantastic experience of people around the table. That's a given. And these are, you know, life goals for me. But on the other hand, you can come in at any level then, George, from what you're saying. And, you know, you can engage in whatever way works for you, which is such an appealing proposition. I'm going back to the floundering, really, aren't I?
Yeah, no, it is one sort of thing. So said you do get better as time goes on. It's like with any sort of skill, but there isn't any big commitment cost. I mean, there are like the initial fees to get dice, to get the initial books, but if a lot of it is, well, make believe. A lot of it is in your mind. So if you want to try and get into it, there isn't much stopping you in the way of, I'm not physically up to it. I don't want to put loads of money in to start a skill which you might not be doing long term. Whereas with something like D&D, the biggest commitment I would say is time. The time to grasp the basics, and then the time to play, because some of the sessions can last a number of hours, and depending on how frequently you want to progress in the story, it can take quite a while sometimes to get forward, depending on how you act as players.
Thanks, George. Both of you talked about that Dungeons and Dragons and playing it can take a lot of time. But often in the stories we hear with other guests is that their commitment, there is an increase in activity, and then they're stepping back and there's re-engaging with the activity. And I get the feeling from listening to you that it requires a commitment of time, but somehow you always find the time for it. Am I right? Is that the right impression? And if that's the case, how and why is time available to you, knowing that you would be both having very busy kind of professional and personal lives? So how is time not an issue and yet it requires time? Or did you just not tell me that time is an issue, so I'm making assumptions here? Martin, can we start with you?
Yeah, I think if you really want to do something and you get value from it, you'll make time. And say we try and put weekends in the diary, probably around about this time of year. We'll normally sort of do a quick doodle poll or something and try and work out if we can find some weekends to get together. So we tend to do it in these kind of intensive bursts. And I don't know whether that's better than doing it more regularly, sort of weekly in an evening or something. But certainly that's the way we've had to do it to be able to fit it around everything else. You say work and family life, but it seems to work. It seems to work for us. But yes, I think if you really want to do something and you're getting some good value from it, you will find a way to do it, I think.
Yeah, just to carry on from that, I find one of the biggest challenges of D&D is normally trying to schedule, make sure everyone's free, everyone's got time, and to knuckle down. Once it starts being going on for a while, though, you do sort of fall into the routine, fall into the pattern. So, for example, with the group I'm with now, because we've been doing it for a while, we've realised that Monday evenings is a time where most of us are normally free. We don't really do much on a Monday. Then going forward, we know not to book a Monday because we know that, that's when I'm playing D&D. That's when I'm doing it with my mates. Because I do mine online, it also makes it a lot easier, because it is a case of, whilst working from home, it's just flipping over to the other computer, logging on and chatting to my friends. So it makes it a lot easier to jump in. And as I said, because I know it's going to be every single Monday, it makes it easier to plan.
Thanks, George. Funnily enough, my improv rehearsals are also on Monday evening. And the scheduling and finding a time is the worst time. So once you've pinned down Monday evening, it becomes the sacred time that nothing ever gets booked on that night. I just finding it funny. That's the same night for you as well, Sam.
Thanks, Betty. Yeah, nice. This is really, really interesting, and I want to build on that. This whole idea of time and space, and the black hole of. Anyway, it's interesting because we're talking about leisure time and how that idea of time takes on a different meaning, doesn't it? So there's a different kind of value proposition to our leisure time, perhaps, than there is our obligated or work time, and how we prioritize both of those things very much depends on what it is we need to be doing, i.e. to pay the bills, but also where we glean those moments or activities that give us that fulfillment that's been kind of outlined by George and Martin. I wanted to talk a bit, in relation to that aspect of time and how you're making those choices and decisions of how and when to prioritize. I just wondered whether you could both talk a little bit about the role that kind of finding the time, the decision to prioritize this over that, has in your negotiation of your work-life balance, if that makes sense. So it's, the stresses and strains of the things we have to do, and how through prioritizing the time or prioritizing the core activity of the playing of Dungeons and Dragons helps you to negotiate that. I just wondered whether, because again, kind of leaning on previous conversations through the podcast, there's differing ways of looking at this, in the sense that for some people, their serious leisure pursuit comes first. Their work is simply a way of paying for that, and having a means of paying the bills in order to keep a roof over their heads. But, if they had the choice, they'd be doing this 100% at the time. But what I'm hearing in how you're both talking about the playing of the game, that core activity, it's an intentional decision on your part in how you negotiate that kind of balance between work and leisure. So I wondered whether you could comment on that for me. Martin, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I think it helps to sort of compartmentalize it a little bit, and to have those kind of chunks every 3 months, something like that, sort of intensive chunks. I think that probably helps. I think I'm very lucky to have a fantastic partner who's very understanding and is very happy for me to go away every now and again and do this with my friends. And I think she really understands about the well-being side of things. I think she gets that, it's a good thing for me that I get to see my friends, go to the pub on the Friday night, have a chat, have a laugh together playing this game, and come back. And I think she understands the importance of that, which is fantastic. So I'm very lucky in that regard, and I think that's true of the partners of all of my friends that I play with. So, but I think it is about just making sure that you do make time for it. It is easier, I think, in some ways if you compartmentalize it a little bit. So it is this kind of slightly ring-fenced section of time that you make the room for. Yes, work can intrude. Sometimes we have to work on weekends. It's trying to plan your workload to make sure that everything is clear, the decks are clear before you're going away to do this. Find yourself prevented from going away at the last minute. So it's about being on top of your workload, I think. But yes, it's not easy in the modern world, and it's probably true for all of us, whatever our interest might be. But I think it's vitally important you do something that gives you joy, brings you joy. That's what life's all about, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, on a similar note, Martin, biggest part, one of the greatest things about it is that sort of mental well-being. I'm quite lucky in the sense that I don't really have much going on a Monday evening. I know that is majority of the time going to be free. If it wasn't for doing D&D and talking to my friends, I would be sitting around watching a movie. I would be reading a book. I would be playing some video games. I would still be trying to do something to improve my mental well-being and to sort of unwind, relax after a tricky day at work. And by doing D&D, it's essentially playing out a movie, it's playing out a book. It's still the same sort of hobby in a more social, in a social setting. And it gives me that opportunity to improve my well-being, so that as a result, by taking that little break for my mind and for my well-being again, it means that for the rest of the week, I can be happier. I can tackle things with a bit more of a positive attitude.
Now, I'm hearing loud and clear the significance and the centrality of all this to your own kind of subjective well-being for both of you, and I think that that will come across equally loud and clear to our listeners as well. Finding that time, that space that is truly our own. I just wanted to kind of highlight some things that I've written down. This is the way I do things on this podcast, and then I start to piece them together at the end and make sense of it as I talk. Which is, again, for me, what's fascinating about these conversations. But really, that co-creation of value. What value the core leisure experience of doing and playing Dungeons and Dragons is for you is very much co-created. It's not something that exists outside of or is prescribed by others. It is co-created in every sense of the word, and I absolutely adore that concept because there's so few opportunities for that, I think. So I wanted to make that observation. I also wanted to make the observation and drawing in that kind of idea of well-being as well, of how that agency, that the authorship, and actually how both of you have stories of, well, actually I am the author of my own well-being here, through prioritizing and finding time and space to actually practice this core activity, this core leisure activity that I find so fulfilling. So that's another key observation for me. But perhaps probably the most powerful one and interesting one for me, and this is going to open a can of worms we don't have time for, but is this whole idea of it being a game. It's a game. It's non-serious. People might say it's only a game, it's a board game. It's and the perception, perhaps the connotation is, well, it's not a serious thing. You're just playing a game. And I love that kind of core tension. It's kind of juxtaposition between, well, actually, no, it is serious to me. And it brings in kind of the whole kind of what the word serious in the context of leisure means from the perspective that we're coming from. So this idea of it having such qualities as, earnestness, sincerity, importance, there's a carefulness to it. So actually, the idea of being serious about a game of this nature is not the same as, say, being serious about your work role. And I think I wanted to draw out that distinction because I think it's such a provocative thing when you say, I play a game seriously, a board game. I'm very serious about playing board games, or I'm very serious about playing role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons. And that connotation from the outside looking in is it's a non-serious thing, when in actual fact, the reality is something very, very different and has huge implications for personal, social well-being. We talked about the importance of belonging, connection, building those bonds of friendship, which do endure. And that, again, is another feature of a serious leisure pursuit, that you might step away from it for a period of time, but coming back in, you're able to lean on those connections, those relationships that you've created. And the core activity remains relatively stable in that regard as well. So I think you've both told different stories, but obviously it's two sides to the same coin, isn't it, really? But you've been very, very articulate in what it means to you, and I've loved hearing about the different experiential components to that. But I just wanted to make that point, that final point about, from the outside looking in, this could be perceived as being something very unserious, but actually in reality, for both of you and for many others, or if not all others playing the game, it is anything but.
Thank you so much, Sam, for your comments. I think it was really interesting to listen to you and think about the word serious leisure and the juxtaposition. Unfortunately, everyone, talking of time, we have run out of time on this podcast. So this is the point where I thank our guests, Martin Williams and George Howard, for their time and their willingness to share their stories with us and give us insight into the world of Dungeons and Dragons. Thank you so much for letting us into this world.
Thank you very much. It's been lovely being here.
Yeah, no, it's been an absolute delight. It's always nice to think back on these sort of things and delve into why I enjoy it so much.
Thank you both again. And I would thank our podcast team, Sam Elkington, Kat Bruns, Julia Denman and Helga Gannerstadeur for their continued support and input, whether it's input that you hear or input behind the scene in this podcast. Thank you, everyone. I hope you keep listening, subscribing, liking this podcast, however it reaches you. And until next time, when we talk about leisure, work and well-being and how and what we can do to engage with leisure seriously. Goodbye.